Portal. Portal. There, now I've got it out of my system. I'm tired of constantly mentioning Portal whenever I talk about first-person puzzle games. It reminds me of the time when every first-person shooter was called a Doom clone. But the thing is that shooters eventually branched out and became their own thing that didn't primarily resemble Doom or Wolfenstein or Quake anymore, so it made sense to call them something else. Just like how all early open-world games were called GTA clones, but then became so ubiquitous and deviated from the typical GTA formula of stealing cars and engaging in crime that they just became open world games instead. Unfortunately, Portal has cast such a long shadow that even years later there are games stuck in it that I'd rather call Portal clones than simply first-person puzzle games. The most recent Portal clone I've covered is Relicta, which employed magnetism for its central mechanic. And apparently that game wasn't all that innovative, because not only did it steal the first-person puzzle idea with isolated puzzle chambers from Portal, it also stole the magnetism mechanic from today's subject, Magnetic Cage Closed. Well, not really, because both of these games have probably stolen it from MagRunner Dark Pulse. But since I haven't played that game yet, I can't comment on how well Magnetic rips it off. But suffice to say that a lot of what these first-person puzzle games tend to do is take great inspiration from games that came before them. So let's ditch the complaint train about the lack of innovation in the first-person puzzle genre and talk about Magnetic based on its own merits. I'll try to keep comparisons to other games to a minimum, but spoiler alert, I'll very much fail at that, the reason for which will become clear shortly. Now, as I said, Magnetic takes a lot of influence from earlier examples, so the game is mostly broken up into individual test chambers that you have to solve with the power of magnetism. To that end, you can manipulate the all too familiar cubes, which must be mandated by law or something, given that they always make an appearance in Portal clones. You can also attract and repel yourself from specific walls to jump around these levels to avoid a variety of hazards. And that's pretty much it. The levels are fairly straightforward obstacle courses, where the challenge comes mainly from figuring out in which order you have to do things, sometimes augmented by specific means of traversal to avoid the hazards, which means first-person platforming. I feel like the magnetic interactions are a bit underdeveloped. It's mostly about putting boxes onto switches to open up new paths on your way to the exit of the test chamber. The game could have benefited of more interactions that shake up the core formula, since it gets a bit stale after doing the same thing over and over again. It seems to me like the developers must have noticed that it gets repetitive fairly quickly, which is why every chapter gets capped off by a decision you get to make. The game tries really hard to convince you that these decisions have consequences for later stages, but they rarely do. Some of them do have an impact on which ending you get, but for that to matter, you have to actually tell a story that benefits from branching endings. Otherwise, you're just making the player replay the same damn levels over and over again to uncover all the endings and make them realize that none of them are particularly satisfying. But before we get to the endings, we first have to tackle what the game is actually about. Magnetic starts off with an underground train ride, and already we see it copying from another landmark title, which is Half-Life. Though thankfully it's a rather brief ride, since it's mostly just used as an exposition dump and there's not a lot there to fill you in on. You play as a death row convict, slated for execution for an unspecified crime, but you're getting a second chance by agreeing to partake in a weapons testing program. I mean, you can choose to not partake by refusing to leave your chamber at the start, but then you'll just get gassed to death and have to start all over again, which incidentally is one of the endings you have to see to get the achievement for having found all of them. Not much of the backstory gets revealed here. In fact, there's not a lot of story going on in the game at all. As is typical for these first-person puzzle games, you get talked at by unseen people every time you enter a chamber. But most of the time it's just inconsequential fluff or strict instructions on how to proceed. The game doesn't really have a story to tell or a point to make. It's never revealed what kind of weapons testing you're doing here beyond being given a magnet gun. And there's not enough depth to either of the two characters talking at you to make listening to them worthwhile. GLaDOS, despite her artificial nature, had a sense of humor that juxtaposed well with the dark implications of the scribbles on the test chambers' walls in Portal. And Cave Johnson was a commanding presence in Portal 2, always good for a laugh but also revealing a lot about the backstory of Aperture Science. And it's clear that these two characters are integral parts of their respective games and how players experience them, because the absence of any of the levity and wit they bring to their stories is sorely felt in Magnetic. But let's get back to the endings you can get. First off, I just played the game once and looked up all the other endings on YouTube, and I suggest you do the same if you intend to play this game, so if you want to do that, you can just close this video now since I'll be spoiling the endings. Though I don't really recommend playing the game and there's not that much to spoil either way. Now I can already disqualify 4 of the endings endings right off the bat, since they just end up unceremoniously killing you, which really isn't worth playing the entire game from the top again. 4 other endings have you exit the prison to live out the rest of your days, with nothing much bookending the respective endings or the choices you've made to reach them. So in total, all these 8 endings can be boiled down to 2 actual endings, one where you die and one where you get to leave the facility. It was at this point where I was really happy that I didn't waste my time replaying the game 8 more times just to figure this out, and I feel really sorry for the poor bastard who did to upload these endings to YouTube. There is also a 9th ending that reveals that the warden, who has been taunting you over the course of the game, is actually a former inmate. One path allows you to exact revenge on your tormentor, and that's the path that the current warden has taken. As a consequence, you're offered his job as a reward for getting him killed. Functionally, there's not much of a difference to the endings where you get to leave the facility alive, since there's no post-ending content where you get to play as the warden, and the game just fades out the second you enter his office to take over his duties. So it's a twist that doesn't really recontextualize anything and thus is entirely wasted. I have to wonder what the developers were thinking when they came up with the idea of these different endings and what point they should serve. Because I honestly can't tell if there was even a point to having half the endings kill you and the other half letting you get out with not much differentiating them. The ending where you get to take over the facility had some potential, but for that to work they would have had to let players learn more about the world this takes place in. As it stands, the story and setting are just too underdeveloped to justify the many endings you can reach, and it just smacks of hubris to think that players would feel satisfied after playing the same damn level 7 or 8 times to get to see all these endings. Never mind the fact that the developers obstinately refuse to put in a proper save system, so you can't even just reload the game at the appropriate choice moments to see all the endings in quick succession. Was it really too much to ask for a bit of quality of life improvement? Because after the first time through, you know all the solutions to the puzzles, so it's not that there is some added challenge to be found. You do it once to figure out all the puzzles, and then the other 7 times it's just rote execution. Where's the fun in that? Now, I'd be lying if I were to tell you that I didn't have fun with the game at all. The puzzles that are there are well designed, and I like the idea of using attraction and repulsion to propel myself through the levels and fly over hazards. But the game just wastes too much time between puzzles with silly choices that don't end up mattering, as well as lengthy transitions between levels. Now, I'm sure that this is to cover loading times, but did you really have to make it this tunnel we have to crawl through that also requires direct player input? Couldn't you just move us from one chamber to the next automatically? In the end, I can't really recommend playing Magnetic Cage Closed. Even among Portal clones, there are better games out there, and this game does little to improve or deviate from the core formula, and in fact removes quite a few things that made Portal great.